Well, hello there. It's February 2026, which means it's time for another episode of Stradivarius Stories. Let's hope that by the next episode in March, Iran will be free, the mullahs will be gone, Shiraz will be producing wine again, the Iranians will be back to where they want to be in the fold, and maybe classical music will take off again in Iran, who knows. So let's hope that Iran will be free from the fascist communist Islamic dictatorship that is murdering its people as we speak. Apparently there is still a Tehran symphony orchestra, but it doesn't play that often and came under severe pressure after the Islamic Revolution. Okay, so now we come on to our story number 1 for episode 3 of Stradivarius Stories, drawing heavily again from the information that's on Tarisio. Awesome information. And we're going to start with the Stradivarius of 1736 called the Spencer Dyke. Now, what is unusual about this Strad? Let's look at what it says about the back. Let's zoom in. One piece of pear wood slab cut, which is quite interesting. And we know that ordinarily the front of a violin is made from spruce and the back and the ribs, sides and neck are made from maple. This one is made from pear wood. Now there's no real notes on the instrument, but what is of interest when we look at the provenance is that it came through the hands of Herbert Axelrod. I made a video all about him and his amazing collection of violins, and perhaps it was one of the instruments that he donated to the New Jersey Symphony Orchestra, and it has a number of known players here. Pearwood is a dense, fine textured hardwood, and see if we can get into this image here, kind of what the slab of pearwood looks like. But here's the front and the back here, so it looks very interesting. It hasn't got the normal flame of maple. Let's see if we can zoom in a little bit. And here we can see kind of what the texture of the wood looks like, which is really interesting. Rare, very rare for a Strad. Who was Spencer Dyke? I guess this was a quartet that was active in England in the 1920s. Spencer Dyke was a Cornish violinist born in St Austell in 1880. So, short story for number 1, the violin with a pearwood back. Now for story number 2, we come on to the Grancino family of violin makers, and the story about how a stabbing brought about the end of Milan's leading 18th century violin workshop. Now, if we look at the family tree of the Grancinos, here we have the Grancino family tree, starting with Andrea, and then coming down to Giovanni Battista Francesco and Giovanni Battista Grancino II. And then beneath him there's Michelangelo and Francesco II. And it's really Giovanni Battista Grancino II who is the interesting character in this story. So sometimes there could be problems between luthiers working in the same town, or between luthiers perhaps and other individuals, and they could get into a little bit of a scrap, and sometimes it could become more serious than that. In this case, and to give you an idea just before we get a bit further into the story, that a Giovanni Battista II could sell for around $231,000. Let's just have a look here. So we got the story of Giovanni Battista Grancino II in Tarisio, but then we have the auction record, in this case for a cello, not a violin, but still gives you an idea of the caliber of the maker. $231,000 plus dollars. But basically what happened with this guy, he had a quarrel with a rival violin maker, Antonio Maria Lavazza like the coffee makers, and this resulted in a fatal stabbing of Lavazza, after which Giovanni Battista was sentenced to death in 1708. He escaped execution by running away into hiding. he continued making violins while he was in hiding, but of inferior quality. And eventually he was pardoned, but by then the family workshop had been sold and his reputation was ruined. So, tragic ending. But it wasn't just that he just went out and stabbed this guy. There was a build-up. So, he was the pupil of his father, Giovanni. Let's just flip back to the family tree a minute. Grancino family tree. Yeah, his father was Giovanni Battista Grancino I, and he was a pupil of his, born in Contrada Largo in 1673. His instruments showed a growing Amati influence. The Grancinos, although being in Milan-based, were faithfully imitating the main characteristics of the Cremonese style, while retaining some original features of their own style. Their instruments concede very little to Stradivarius' growing influence in Cremona, so more Amati influenced than Strad influenced. In 1694, Giovanni Battista had married a woman named Laura Gualina. The couple remained living in the family house that adjoined the workshop on the Contrada Largo. 2 children were born to them, Michelangelo and Francesco. They were perhaps involved in violin making later in the century. But tragedy was soon to come. The relationship between Milan's violin makers was not always peaceful. In the autumn of 1708, Antonio Maria Lavazza, a gifted violin maker about 10 years younger than Giovanni Battista Grancino II, who also lived and worked on the Contrada Largo, started to have disagreements with Giovanni Battista. We do not know what these were about, but the situation deteriorated to the point that Lavazza stabbed Grancino with a sword. Giovanni Battista was severely injured. Lavazza was forbidden to go near the Grancino workshop while the authorities were considering the case, but breaking this ban, Lavazza visited his colleague's place, found him there, his leg injured. According to Grancino's later declaration, Lavazza attacked him again, but this time it was Grancino who stabbed Lavazza. He was wounded and died 2 years later. That is actually how things unfolded then. He was sort of defending himself, so it makes you wonder why he was sentenced to death after that. We've got this whole article here on Tarisio and also some beautiful photos here of the instruments. And of course, if you go under, that one's interesting, very interesting. If you go under the maker, in Tarisio, you can see you have to have a subscription, which mine is just renewing. You can see all these fine violins and cellos and whatnot. So, yeah, that's the guy. And what happened is then he was prosecuted, fled to avoid jail, sentenced to death in absence. And then while the trial was proceeding, his father, Giovanni Grancino, died because the properties were inherited by Giovanni Battista II, who was sentenced to death. The family properties were confiscated, which included the house and workshop, forcing Giovanni's widow, Giovanni Battista's wife, and all their children to leave the family home. How sad. And then she asked permission to remain in the house and pay rent in order to keep the workshop going. Michelangelo and Francesco stepped up and took on the business in the workshop, apparently. But this might have looked like a ruse to help Giovanni Battista, since the elder of the 2 boys was only 10 years old. Yeah, but perhaps they did move in, perhaps they did take up violin making a bit later on. They moved into a small apartment not far away, and the house was sold by the court in 1715. The Grancinos were never able to get it back. And then during this long period in hiding, Giovanni was making some instruments to be able to support his family, which explains the sudden fall in quality of the workmanship, and particularly the varnish. So he's like making instruments while in hiding and on the run. Sometime after 1716, he obtained a pardon, an act of grace, and returned to join his family as a free man, but by then he was ruined. The old family workshop was no more in his possession. His name was disgraced and the family fortune was gone. Labels dated after 1708 are difficult to find. Perhaps he avoided signing his instruments, or it's possible that his demand for his instruments had become very limited, and then he was also facing competition from his former assistant, Carlo Giuseppe Testore, whose career was starting to peak. We do not know where and when Giovanni Battista died. It was probably in the 1720s in the area surrounding the Contrada Lager in Milan. So, yeah, things weren't always rosy between these luthiers. They could get a little bit hot-headed and actually have feuds, and sometimes that could be fatal. People especially outside the city walls, the safety of the city walls, people could get jumped, attacked, robbed, killed. These kind of things happen. We know that places like Cremona are also badly affected by plagues, wars, and all kinds of things. And amidst all this chaos, violin makers were able to continue to persevere. But in some cases, the family tradition was severely impacted, and was the end of the line. Almost, yeah, for some of them. So that was story number 2, the Grancino family, how a stabbing brought about the end of Milan's leading 18th century violin workshop. Fine Milanese maker who suffered tragedy and problems in his life. For story number 3, we're back to considering interesting wood on a Stradivarius, in this case the C1670 Toloya, an early Strad. And what's interesting about the wood on this one, so story number 3 is entitled The Violin with Knots. It had knots in the wood. So let's see what it says here. The back, one piece cut on the slab, marked by a small column with 4 knots down the centre. Now, it's interesting that Stradivari always selected, I think, as far as I know, really good quality wood. The wood was hardened because the trees had been through a mini ice age, and that's why they say that these violins of this period, the Del Jesus, the Strads, the Bergonzis, the Amatis, were so powerful because of the quality of the wood, where the trees had been through a mini ice age. Why did Strad select, here you can see the knots here, why did he select a slab of maple here in this case, not pear wood like the other one, but the standard maple that contained knots like this? Was it that he just wanted to experiment with that effect, or was it slightly inferior wood because it was earlier on in Strad's career? I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but if we click on this full size here, well, we can really see it's actually quite beautiful, isn't it? And very different, very unique. There may be 1 or 2 other examples of Strads like that where there's knots in the wood, but it stands out for that reason. Just looking over the prominence here, nothing too special other than that it looks like it's owned by a bank. Some of especially the German banks and Austrian banks, it seems they like to invest in fine instruments from time to time, and we don't have any details of known players, so remains to just do a Google search to see if we can find anything on this violin outside of Tarisio. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Tarisio is really an amazing database of instruments. Okay, there's something on Instagram. You can sometimes get some interesting little tidbits on there. Let's see what's going on here on Instagram about this violin. Violin is really special. Heifetz my idol. Yeah. Is the Instagram guy here. It demonstrates that great luthiers of the past not always had the best choice of wood possible. But it must be hard in this case if it's got knots in it. It must have been quite hard maybe to cut it and gouge it out. This piece has 3 knots, but Stradivari decided to transform it into a great violin. The absence of perfection gives away something special. Yeah, that's a nice comment, isn't it? So that was story number 3, the violin with 3 knots. For story number 4, we come on to the Stradivarius violin kept in an English country home. The violin kept in an English country house, and in those days it was quite fashionable for the rich and famous, or the socialites, the aristocrats, business tycoons to acquire a Strad. It was like a fashionable item to acquire. Less so these days, but then again, I think people were more musically inclined in those days, so they would be maybe amateur musicians and perhaps had more of an interest in musical instruments. So this violin is the 1692 Bennett. I guess we're in Strad's long period, and we can zoom into the notes here in tertio. The violin was unknown to the trade until 1915, when it was acquired by W.E. Hill and Sons after many years in an English country house. There were indications that it might at one time have belonged to Spagnoletti. Here we have the provenance. So we don't know too much about it before the Hills acquired it in 1915. But it spent a long time in an English country house. Maybe it was one of those that was stuffed into a cupboard or under a bed or something and wasn't played for a long time. Who knows? Or perhaps maybe it was being played by the lord of the house or a lady in the house. They had musical soirees. Maybe there's some more information out there somewhere on this 1692 Bennett Stradivarius. Okay, for our final story, story number 5, we're going back to a third story to do with the wood used by Stradivarius on a violin. Again, a long period Strad. In this case, the 1697 Morbel Stradivarius. So again, just in the long period, I guess, and just a few years before Strad's golden period would start. It's got a beautiful varnish, this one. See some images there from the Stradivarius books of the scrolls, but then the only other two images are in black and white, it seems. And we can see there a beautiful one piece back with flames. Now this one has several knots in the lower right, which is quite interesting. So another one with knots. Let's see if we can zoom in and full size is not giving me a great size here, yeah, but we can just perceive the knots here in the bottom of the violin there. So remember to hold my mic a bit closer. Let's go back to the tertio notes here, because here's where we read about the sap marks. A peculiar feature found on the back is a series of irregular sap marks that, like a swarm of bees attracted by the sugary varnish, have populated the bottom corner on the right hand side, providing the instrument with a distinguishing mark. And quite some provenance there. Again, it's being held by a bank since 1988. They invest in them, and often what the banks will do is they'll then loan the instruments out to find players to play them. This bank has had quite a few instruments come through its hands, including the one we looked at earlier with the knot. So they seem to have a thing for collecting Strads with knots in them. So that was Stradivarius Stories for February 2026. 5 fascinating stories, I'm sure you'll agree. 4 of them to do with Strads, 1 to do with the Grancino luthiers, and hopefully in a future episode we'll make a foray a little bit into some of the Del Gesù stories. But for now, I'm going to say ciao violinisti, and thanks for listening.